The morning of the flight began with anxiety and uncertainty. Axel and Vera Johnson were not sure that they would be able to leave their ranch on the outskirts of El Paso, Texas, fly to Wichita, Kansas for a cattle buying expedition as Axel had been nursing a bad cold for the previous 5 days. Axel is a private pilot with a multi- and single-engine land plane rating with a total of 1,690 hours. Axel had no instrument training and was flying his Mooney 231 on this August summer day. At 6 a.m., Axel awoke feeling better after having a bad cold for the previous 5 days. The night before, he had taken a sedative cough suppressant, which allowed him to sleep throughout the night. Axel called flight service, and the weather on the route was VFR, but there was slight to moderate turbulence below the clouds, which covered the sky from 6,500 to 8,500 feet. Axel didn't want to turn his wife off from flying forever with a very bumpy 4-hour flight, so flying below the clouds was not a favorable option. Axel, being a heavy smoker, was uncomfortable flying at high altitudes, and going above the turbulence would make him fly at an altitude of 9,500 feet. Axel called the airport and requested his plane to be checked and pulled out of the hangar at 8 o'clock, and requested the counter girl to locate oxygen to either rent, borrow, or buy for the flight. When Axel and Vera arrived at the airport at 7:45, the plane was ready for the flight, although oxygen equipment had not been found on such short notice. He called flight service for another weather update, hoping for better news and some advice, but flight service is not prepared or equipped to offer such technical advice. Flight service said the turbulence was expected to ease up closer to Wichita, and the weather was forecast to improve. Axel and Vera decided to fly through the turbulence because it would be safer than flying above the clouds at such a high altitude without oxygen equipment. As they took off, Axel climbed straight up through the open spaces between the clouds without consulting Vera. He decided that he would rather suffer than make Vera suffer through the turbulence. They leveled off at 9,500 feet, being VFR over the top and in perfectly smooth air. Axel never liked the breathless feeling at high altitude. Being a fairly heavy smoker, going up to 8,000 or 9,000 feet bothered him, usually noticeably, but not this day. As Axel started to descend, he reached a dead end in the clearing, entering the cumulus cloud. It had been a sucker hole which had filled up quickly. Axel became disoriented and rapidly looked at the VSI. The aircraft was losing 1,400 feet per minute, instead of the initial 500 feet per minute which the plane had been trimmed out for. The cold Axel thought he was over was reawakened and fully disabled him with spatial disorientation and vertigo. Pain in his head and disorientation left the plane without a pilot. He was unable to control the aircraft's attitude and let it fall out of the sky as it wished. Axel found himself worrying that the plane would fall apart, but was unable to control the attitude because his head felt like it was being split apart and was spinning. Within 100 miles of Wichita, the cloud tops began to get higher and thicker. Axel pondered whether the cloud tops ahead of them were as high or higher than he was. Past an area where the cloud coverage was only 25%, decided to proceed and descend later, pondering for the next 10 minutes if he should turn around or not as the clouds ahead of him continued to grow and thicken. He didn't turn around because he didn't want to waste any time or fuel. His indecision put him in 80% cloud coverage to descend through, which was not ideal. He spotted a break in the clouds and decided to descend through the clearing. Less than a minute later, the Mooney was thrown out of the first cumulus cloud at an angle of bank of 75 degrees at 7,700 feet. The aircraft righted itself and resumed the 500 feet per minute descent. Entering the next cloud, they hit an updraft and began climbing, pushing the airspeed past redline immediately. Axel was stimulated by the updraft. He reduced the power and neutralized the plane. This may have been what saved their lives. The turbulence was worse than Axel had ever experienced. His ear pain and dizziness had him on the edge of unconsciousness. Coming out of the final cloud at 4,500 feet, the Mooney was in a steep left bank and diving towards the ground, dangerously exceeding V&E. The Mooney recovered itself again, slightly bent and losing an additional 1,500 feet before Axel was able to regain control and level off. Within minutes, Axel's ear pain subsided and he was again piloting command. Axel allowed himself several minutes to regain his wits before calling the Wichita approach. He advised the controller that he was low on fuel and had just been through a terrible ride. When asked if he wanted to declare an emergency, he declined. The controller gave Axel a discrete transponder code and vectored to fly towards the airport, including instructions to descend to 2,500 feet. Axel acknowledged and began to comply. Axel noticed that something was wrong. The yoke didn't feel right, and the airplane wasn't responding correctly. He looked outside and checked his wings and as much of his tail section as he could. He didn't spot anything wrong. Had he asked Vera to check, she may have noticed that a substantial portion of the horizontal stabilizer was missing. But he didn't ask and she didn't look. Axel advised the controller that he was having a control problem. The controller advised that there would be 2 airplanes landing ahead of them, and then the runway would be free. The controller also informed Axel that he would be landing on a 7,300-foot runway, and that he may want to come in with a higher approach speed, as the stall speed may be elevated. Proceeding on the approach, Axel wasn't doing well. When the controller spotted the Mooney, they were 100 yards to the left of the runway and advised them to maintain runway track. The airplane was lurching from left to right and the nose was dropping and rising uncontrollably. The Mooney mushed in from 120 feet, the nose wheel hit the ground first, followed by the right main gear hitting, collapsing 1,000 feet short of the runway into rocky terrain. The Mooney stayed together with no fire. Emergency response personnel arrived and helped Axel and Vera out of the plane. At the hospital, the doctor said that Axel was fine, just getting over the flu and probably shouldn't have been flying that day. When Axel got close to the airport and realized he was flying a damaged aircraft, he never figured out how to handle his plane properly. The airplane flew at 9,500 feet for nearly 4 hours, and Axel and his wife felt fine. One of the symptoms of hypoxia is euphoria, the feeling of well-being. The judgment not to turn back to the easy letdown conditions is a definite indication of hypoxia. Vertigo and ear problem were also an issue, results of Axel's cold and hypoxic state. The two together were devastating, and it is wonder that Axel didn't become unconscious. Axel evidently ran out of fuel both physically and mentally.
With high altitude flying, there is always the risk of becoming hypoxic, a condition in which the body is deprived of adequate oxygen supply. It can be classified as general, affecting the whole body, or local, affecting a specific region of the body. There is a tendency for euphoria to develop, while motor skills and reasoning abilities deteriorate. The result being that the pilot may become seriously hypoxic without even knowing it. To the pilot, the only symptoms may be slight dizziness, fatigue, decreasing vision, and loss of muscular control.
This graph compares the concentration of oxygen in the blood versus altitude. As you can see, once above 10,000 feet ASL, the concentration drops off rapidly.
Tolerance to hypoxia varies from individual to individual. Tolerance can be increased by continual high-altitude exposure. It is decreased by fatigue, colds, and poor physical conditioning. Most pilots can operate safely up to a cabin altitude of 10,000 feet if they are in good health and are non-smokers. Heavy smokers can become hypoxic at altitudes 5,000 to 7,000 feet lower than non-smokers. A heavy smoker may become very hypoxic at levels significantly lower than 10,000 feet. This explains why Axel was bothered when flying above 7,000 feet ASL. Cigarette smoking causes a reduction in the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. It causes blockages of carbon dioxide in the hemoglobin. As your hemoglobin becomes more blocked, your ceiling becomes lower. Although regulations do not require the pilot to use supplemental oxygen below 10,000 feet ASL, Axel should not have flown at 9,500 feet without it. Due to the fact that Axel was a heavy smoker, when he was flying at this altitude, his tolerance to hypoxia was actually that of a non-smoker at 15,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, oxygen is required for the entire time at this altitude. The fact that cold medicine was also in his system would have also made him more susceptible to hypoxia.
Oxygen is one of the fuels that your body uses for energy, and hypoxia is the condition where your body doesn't have enough oxygen to function normally, and that's manifest when things like your brain start to struggle and stumble and start to shut down. Some of the factors that will affect the way that some people will get hypoxia, the most important factors are altitude and time. So the higher the altitude, the more severe the hypoxia, means that you'll experience hypoxia in a shorter period of time. But then some personal factors are things like if you're cold, well then your body starts to burn oxygen to generate heat, and the oxygen that's burnt to keep you warm isn't available to help your brain function normally. And then personal factors like smoking. So if you smoke 20 cigarettes a day, the amount of hypoxia that your body would have would be equivalent to about 5,000 feet. So if you're in a cabin altitude of 8,000 feet and you're a heavy smoker, the amount of oxygen that is being delivered to your brain would be equivalent to about 13,000 feet, and that's an altitude where we would know that you would get hypoxia symptoms. Some other things, like if you're physically active, well then your body is using oxygen to make the muscles move. Again, that's reducing the oxygen delivery to your brain. And also things like your general state of health and your level of physical fitness can also determine how efficiently your body uses oxygen. And if you're not very physically fit, well then your body uses a lot of oxygen to function, which will lower your threshold for developing hypoxia. But most importantly, hypoxia is insidious because it actually erodes the high mental functions that are useful in helping you to identify and have the critical insight to know that you're becoming hypoxic, which is more difficult when your brain's not functioning properly. The concept of the hypoxia signature is really there to illustrate to aircrew that individuals react differently to each other with hypoxia, but within an individual it's fairly consistent. And so if you sign your name, we know that that's your signature, and you can recognise your signature over many years, even though it might change slightly from sort of 1 year to years later, but we can recognise that as being your signature. So the hypoxia signature is the group of symptoms that you would experience that you would recognise as being your own experience of hypoxia. And it's that hypoxia signature that you would be recognising during flight that would allow you to identify that you are developing hypoxia, and then give you the opportunity to respond to that.
Yes, the difficulty in recognising hypoxia is that many people have not been exposed to it before, so that's one of the reasons and goals of hypoxic training, is to expose somebody so that they experience the symptoms. The insidious nature of the onset of the hypoxia is because we are using up the oxygen reserve, and the oxygen available in the bloodstream progressively decreases as we use up the reserve. And there is no magic number or line at which we suddenly become aware of the fact that something adverse is happening to oxygen supply and to brain function. So the major difficulty lies in the fact that a brain which is already deteriorating in function because of a reducing oxygen supply has to make decisions about the fact that this is happening.
The benefit of hypoxia training is that it allows aircrew to recognise the symptoms of hypoxia early, so that they've got more time to take corrective action, and they can recognise the symptoms of hypoxia early because they've previously experienced those symptoms in a safe training environment.
During a flight, the air pressure in the sinuses and middle ear must equalize with the cabin pressure inside the airplane, which changes with ascent and descent. A cold can cause a blockage in the eustachian tube, which connects the middle ear to the back of the nose and maintains equal air pressure on both sides of the eardrum.
When the eustachian tube is blocked, extreme pain, vertigo, ringing in the ears, and even hearing loss can occur. This creates a distraction from flying and may impair a pilot's decision-making abilities. For this reason, doctors recommend that flying be avoided when experiencing a cold. When Axel began his descent through the clouds, his cold caused sharp head pains, spatial disorientation, and vertigo. The head pains and dizziness put him on the verge of passing out, rendering him helpless and not in control of his aircraft. Due to the seriousness of this condition, He allowed the aircraft to react as it wished to the intense turbulence within the cloud, without any recovery or control. This resulted in the plane entering a sharp dive and dangerously exceeding redline.
Pilot decision-making is an important and essential part of any flight. Axel's lack of decision-making skills led him to a dangerous situation in which he is lucky to walk away from. Following are two examples of decision-making models commonly used by pilots to ensure the safety of their flight. This is the perceive, process, and perform model. Perceive. The given set of circumstances for a flight. Axel was recovering from a head cold at the time the flight began, and had taken medication to lessen the effects of his cold. You should not fly with cold or after taking any medication that can affect your ability to fly the aircraft. The weather forecast called for very turbulent conditions under the clouds along their route. This required them to climb above the clouds in order to avoid the turbulence. Axel was a heavy smoker and had trouble breathing when flying above 7,000 feet. When he tried to borrow or rent oxygen equipment, he was unable to. This means that any high altitude flying would put him at risk of becoming hypoxic and directly affecting his ability to fly the aircraft and make safe decisions. Process. Evaluate the impact such circumstances have on flight safety. Flying with a cold can greatly affect your ability to fly the aircraft. It affects the equalization in your inner ear and can leave the person victim to vertigo and very bad head pains. Axel had taken 4 cold tablets the day before, plus a sedative cough suppressant about 10 hours prior to takeoff. Cold medicine affects its users and is unsafe to use within 24 hours of the flight. Some side effects of cold relief medicine include dizziness, drowsiness, headache, blurred vision, impaired thinking, and reactions. Most cold medications warn users to avoid driving after taking the medication, since their vision and alertness may be impaired. If you cannot drive after using this medication, it is clear that you should not operate an aircraft as well. Another circumstance affecting the flight was high altitude flying, which must be executed with care and caution. CARS provides regulations for the use of oxygen when flying above 10,000 feet, but it is also important to keep in mind that people who are heavy smokers or are in poor physical health will experience hypoxia at levels 5,000 to 7,000 feet lower than non-smokers. Perform. Implement the best course of action. Best course of action would have been for Axel and Vera Johnson to not go flying. They should have had a plan B in advance, considering the fact that Axel had been sick for 5 days prior to the flight. With the importance of their trip, they should have had a plan to get there without flying themselves in the event that it was unsafe to fly.
Another decision-making model often used by pilots is the anticipate, recognize, and act model. Axel could have used this decision-making model while flying to make the safest and most effective decision on how to descend through the thickening cloud layer. Anticipate. What could go wrong? Hope for the best, plan for the worst. When Axel saw the growing cloud layer above him, he should have anticipated that it would have been difficult and unsafe to descend if he proceeded on his course. Axel was over an area that had only 25% cloud coverage, while he was trying to decide whether the clouds were at his altitude or above him. Recognize. Has something gone wrong? For Axel, this should have been apparent when he was flying over the thickening and rising cloud mass. He was unable to see many clear breaks in the cloud at this point, indicating that the cumulus conditions were intensifying. Evaluate your options and choose one. Take prompt action. Axel spent 10 minutes after passing over a clear area below him to decide whether he should descend or proceed at his current altitude. He was continuously flying into worse conditions, leaving him with limited options, time, and fuel. Axel decided to take his chances and descend through a small pocket in the thick cloud mass when he could have spent 10 minutes worth of fuel to return to the area which he knew was safe. It is imperative that pilots are always thinking far ahead of their airplane. Axel should have taken the opportunity to descend safely when he had it. The wasted time and poor decision to not turn back to the clear area, which he had passed over minutes prior, left him in a vulnerable position, descending through severely turbulent cumulus layers. Communication is another important aspect of flying. Without effective communication, a few significant details of any flight can slip through the cracks and go unnoticed. In this flight, there were a few communication breakdowns which led to Axel inadvertently landing short of the runway. When Axel was initially climbing out, he climbed up above the clouds to an altitude at which he didn't feel comfortable flying at. He did not discuss this decision with his wife Vera, as they previously agreed to fly below the cloud and to deal with the turbulence. Axel was putting both himself and Vera at risk without informing her of the danger they could possibly be in. Later, when Axel was having trouble controlling the aircraft on approach, he quickly checked the wings and part of the tail that he could see, and failed to ask Vera to look out her side of the plane for damage. If Vera had looked out of her side, they would have known that they were missing part of their stabilizer. This lack of communication between Axel and Vera led to them being unaware of the severity of their condition while trying to land. It is important as pilot in command of any aircraft to be communicating with your passengers, crew members, and air traffic controllers at all times. Although you are in control of the aircraft, communicating with others may help to maintain a safe flying environment.
Maneuvering speed. The speed is not on the airspeed indicator, however, it is a very important design speed. At or below the speed, your aircraft can structurally survive a full control, deflection, and turbulence. What that really means is that your chances of surviving severe turbulence are excellent at or below maneuvering speed. An encounter with severe turbulence above maneuvering speed could cause structural damage. Red line. This is a never exceed speed called VNE. Airspeeds in excess of red line may cause structural damage or failure and may cause a destructive aerodynamic phenomenon called flutter. A control surface that flutters will self-destruct in a matter of seconds. Don't fly past VNE. Control flutter is what likely caused the failure of the horizontal stabilizer after Axel had surpassed his VNE.